My name is Ilan Vashtir, and for 19 cycles I ran the pain connectome registry at the Halcyon Annex. By the time the human came through our doors, my team had mapped the calibrated suffering threshold of 41 sapient species. We had a number for everyone, a clean, defensible number, plotted on the same axis, filed under the same protocol. The human was supposed to be the 42nd line on a graph we had already drawn. The annex itself is not a glamorous posting. We occupy 3 sublevels beneath the Concord's Medical College, a warren of scanning bays and data vaults that smell faintly of cooling gel and old paperwork, because half our archive predates digital storage, and nobody has had the budget to migrate it. I took the post because the work mattered to me, in a way few administrative postings do. Pain is the one variable every species shares, in some form, and I had convinced myself that mapping it carefully, species by species, was a kind of quiet diplomacy, proof that another mind's suffering could be measured with the same respect as your own. I still believe that. I simply no longer believe we had measured anything close to the whole picture. I want to be honest about how little we expected from that session. The requisition came through as a courtesy slot, a human auxiliary attached to a trade delegation, volunteering for a battery of routine scans in exchange for medical clearance paperwork being expedited. Routine. My deputy, Sorn Halkett, logged the appointment under low priority, the same shelf as the dental imaging and the inner ear baseline tests. We were not expecting a finding. We were expecting an entry. The human's name was Daniel Okafor. He was unremarkable to look at, middling height, a civilian engineer's calluses on his hands, a tired patience in his eyes, that I now understand was simply what a human looks like when asked to sit still for an hour. He read a technical manual on his data slate, while Halkett fitted the cortical mesh to his scalp. He asked, without looking up, whether the procedure would hurt. Halkett told him yes, by design, but never beyond what the protocol allowed. He nodded and kept reading. The protocol is simple in concept and ruthless in execution. A calibrated nerve conduction stimulus, beginning below the threshold of sensation and climbing in fixed increments, while the full connectome, the entire wiring diagram of active neural pathways, is recorded in real time. Every species we had mapped showed the same shape of curve. Activity rises smoothly through the early increments. Then, at a point specific to that species' physiology, the pattern breaks. The orderly signal cascades into what we call failure architecture, a flood of conflicting priority signals, motor override attempts, a collapse of the higher reasoning lattice, as the organism's entire nervous system reorganizes itself around the single fact of the stimulus. That collapse point is the number we file. It is, candidly, the only number that matters in the registry. It tells you where a mind stops being a mind and starts being an alarm. We began Okafor at increment 1. The display behaved exactly as expected. Clean activation along the expected pathways. A small elevation in his autonomic baseline. Nothing remarkable. We climbed through increments 2 and 3. Still nothing remarkable. Though I noted, almost as an aside to Halkett, that his higher reasoning lattice showed no degradation at all. Most species show a slight narrowing of attention by increment 3. Okafor's connectome looked, if anything, more focused. By increment 6 we had passed the median failure point of every land-adapted species in our registry. Halkett glanced at me. I told him to continue. The protocol does not allow us to stop early on a hunch. The registry depends on consistency. At increment 9, past the failure point of 3 apex predator species we had mapped at considerable expense and no small institutional risk, Okafor set down his data slate, rolled his neck once, and said that the readout panel beside him was displaying its numbers a touch too small for his eyes, and would we mind enlarging the font? Halkett did not answer him. Halkett was looking at the connectome display, where the higher reasoning lattice remained, against every precedent in our records, entirely intact. Around me, the rest of the cartography unit had gone quiet, in the way a room goes quiet when everyone has noticed the same wrong thing at once, but no one wants to be first to say it aloud. Senior technician Dovre Mall, who had run the Apex Predator sessions years before Okafor's appointment, stood with her arms folded, watching the lattice readout the way you watch a structure you expect to fail. It did not fail, she finally said, quietly, that the species classification on the intake form must be wrong, that no unaugmented organism processes input at this density without cost. I told her the genetic panel had already confirmed the classification twice. She did not look reassured. I want to be precise about what alarmed us, because it was not the absence of distress. We have mapped species that mask distress. Predators with control discipline, soldiers with conditioning. Masking shows up on a connectome regardless of what the face does, because the suppression itself costs activity somewhere in the lattice. There is always a tax. Okafor's scan showed no tax. The pathways carrying the pain signal were fully active. He was not numb. The data was unambiguous on that point. But nothing downstream of the signal was paying for it. It simply arrived, was logged by some attentive part of him, and was set aside, the way one sets aside a notification to deal with later. By increment 12, 3 full increments past anything in our 41 species archive, I made the decision myself to halt the climb and run a verification pass, because I assumed instrument drift. Halkett ran the calibration check twice. Both times, the equipment reported nominal. The number was real. I asked Okafor, through the translation node, how the stimulus felt. He considered the question with what looked like genuine effort, the way a person tries to describe a smell. He said it felt like a bad cramp from a long shift, the kind you get used to ignoring by the 3rd hour of a job. He asked if we were almost done, because he had a connecting transport to catch. We were not almost done. We climbed to increment 15, the calibrated ceiling of the instrument itself, a level no prior subject had survived consciousness past, let alone coherence. Okafor's connectome at increment 15 showed in a reasoning lattice operating at 91% of his own baseline. He was, by every measure we had, still thinking clearly. He used that clarity to ask Halkett whether the annex validated parking. Halkett ended the session. Not because the protocol required it. The protocol had no provision for this. Because the protocol assumed a ceiling existed somewhere beneath the equipment's maximum. He ended it because there was nothing left to record that wasn't already obvious, and because I think, watching the display, he felt something that the registry has no access for. We sat with the data for 3 days before I filed my report to the Concord Oversight Board. I want to describe what that report does not contain, because the omission is the most honest thing about it. It does not contain a threshold for human pain, because we found no threshold. It contains, instead, a flat curve climbing to the edge of our instrument's capability with no inflection point at all. A species whose nervous system processes catastrophic input as information rather than emergency, indefinitely, as far as our equipment was able to test. I have sat across from warriors of 6 species who fought wars of extermination and watched their threshold lines on this same graph. Every one of them had a point past which the mind gave way to the body. Okafor had a connecting transport to catch. The Oversight Board shelved the registry's human entry rather than publish it. Not suppressed. Shelved, the way you shelve a measurement you suspect is correct and wish you did not have to act on. The official annotation, the only line that made it into the archived file, reads, "Subject's failure architecture not observed within instrument range. Recommend no further calibrated testing of this species without revised safety sealing." I wrote that line myself. I have read it more times than any other sentence in my career, because it is the closest the Concord's clinical language comes to admitting fear. Halkett asked me once, off the record, what we would have seen if the instrument had gone higher. I told him I did not know, and that not knowing was the actual finding. We had spent 19 cycles building a registry to tell us where minds break. We had finally met one we could not find the edge of, sitting in a chair, asking about parking. I do not believe Daniel Okafor ever understood what his connectome told us. I do not think he was being brave. I think, and this is the part the report could not say in clinical language, that for that species, the stimulus simply was not an emergency. It was data, and a mind that treats catastrophic data as merely data is not a mind we know how to file. We have not run another human pain study since.